a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride, but she don't care.
Hi everyone, it's Melbourne Games Coach again, back with the 7th and final episode of Ticket to Ride, a look at my games from the 2011 Ryde-Eastwood Open, which is now a bit over a month ago in Sydney. This is my 7th and final round game against Peng Yu Chen. He's got a FIDE rating of 2094 and an Australian rating of 2156, so I am something of an underdog coming into this game, and I'm playing white. Started off with a system I play sort of from time to time, at least, the Trompovsky, and he played the E6 line. I've been playing this in the games I've played recently with it. The usual kind of moves here are to play E4 and sort of H6 takes, Queen takes, and from this position it branches off and you've got lines of sort of Knight F3 or Knight C3 or C3, Knight E2 is even also a possibility to play F4, and I've found that often, regardless of whichever move order I play, black often ends up playing a move like D5 and getting into a French sort of structure, and I've just had difficulty playing these kind of lines. Obviously it's not a bad position in itself, but the recent times where I've got sort of positions like this, I've managed to find myself in trouble in sort of the late and middle game, often to do with sort of problems around the D4 pawn or potentially issues on the queen side. So in order to avoid that, I guess in part at least, plus as a way to get it, I suppose a bit more out of book, as though this isn't far enough out of book already. Here I played C4. So something a little bit different. Obviously you can play D5 and it transposes into a mainline Queen's Gambit after Knight C3. This is a possibility that I was happy to go down. But Peng Yu decided to play C5, and what we actually end up with is a kind of unusual sort of position in Benoni. So I played D5, he captured on D5, and then played H6. And this is where I have my first sort of big decision about what to do. Given that he's sort of delayed the H6 idea, I don't really want to play bishop takes F6 so much anymore, because he can simply play queen takes F6, just put the pawn on D6. It's like a normal sort of Benoni position where he hasn't got any real disadvantages about the position. I also didn't like the idea of playing bishop back to H4. Again, he's sort of got that H6 move, so he can, if need be, play G5 at some stage. There might be some issues with the D5 pawn, depending on what happens. But I just didn't really like the resulting position. The other alternatives here was sort of, again, it was a bit of an awkward choice. There's also issues with Queen A5 at some point, and if I have to play, say, Queen D2, for example, to block the check, then you can simply swap queens and take on D5. So this was part of the thing I was worried about. So I decided to play the slightly unusual move of bishop C1. He played a fairly logical follow-up, G6. I played Knight C3, D6, E4, Bishop G7, and it almost looks like a regular Benoni position. If you look at it sort of from the start, the usual sort of Benoni move order, something like this, G6. This is the normal type of position, and if you compare this position to the one we have in the game, Obviously there's two differences, that black has a bishop on g7 already and a pawn on h6. So the pawn on h6 is a potential weakness, but he does have that extra move ahead in terms of development with bishop g7. This is something that was a bit of an issue for me later on, and sort of changed a plan that I was sort of looking at doing. I played bishop d3, which is a normal sort of developing move in this position. Castle on h3, just to stop sort of ideas of the bishop coming out to sort of g4. So if I do ever play knight f3, I don't have to worry about this sort of potential problem of a pin. So just trying to control that g4 square. And the idea here was so that I could play sort of knight f3 and then sort of knight d2 and look at overprotecting this e4 pawn, also with maybe ideas as well of going after this d6 pawn with a knight. But as we'll see, he plays rook e8 in this position, and ordinarily I'd already have the knight on f3 in this position. The Benoni move order and the pawn would be back on h7. But given that I've played it via this sort of unorthodox method, he's already got significant pressure on the e-pawn. So the immediate threat is to actually take on e4, and whichever piece I recapture with the knight or the bishop, he simply plays f5 and wins back his piece because of this pressure on the e-pawn and the pin on the file. So obviously with the knight, if the knight was already on f3, that wouldn't be a problem because I could simply castle and then I could go about playing my knight d2 and knight c4 plan that I was looking at. But the fact that I've lost a move makes this not possible in the position. So I have to go to plan B. In this case I chose to play knight g to e2, again to stop this, or break the potential problems on the e file. Knight a6 is a logical move. I castle and Peng Yu played knight b4, which is fairly aggressive. Often that knight, rather than going to b4, it often goes back to c7 to help support a b5 advance. Fritz actually likes in this position bishop b5, and it actually wants to give up an exchange for black, so rook takes e4, knight takes e4. And again, you've got pretty reasonable looking black pieces in this position. You've got the sort of the bishop working on the diagonal. You've got these two knights that help control sort of all these key squares, as well as putting obviously some pressure on the d5 pawn as well. So interesting in some ways. Obviously now you've also got fairly straightforward development in terms of the bishop that can come out to f5. So I don't actually mind this position so much for black, even though obviously white is an exchange ahead. So instead of that after knight b4, I actually preferred to play bishop back to b1. My idea being that I can eventually play a3, kick the knight, the bishop can go back to d3 at some stage if need be, mainly as a way to get this rook on a1 out. I think the best spot for it is somewhere on one of these center files. I'm not sure exactly which at the moment, probably the C or D file. This F rook probably wants to go to the E file. So obviously in order to do that I've got to do something about these two bishops on B1 and C1 at the moment. So the plan would be to kick the knight on B4 away and then probably move the bishops to say E3 and D3, and then move the rook out to sort of C1 or D1 depending on how the position develops. However, after bishop B1, Peng Yu takes the opportunity to play B5. The point being that obviously if I play knight takes B5, I'm taking away a defender away from E4, so he then has knight takes E4, and doesn't have to sacrifice any material to get rid of the e-pawn. So I played f3 just to again reinforce that b pawn, and now I'm actually threatening to win the b5 pawn. Plays rook b8 to defend. Bishop f4, which is a useful move, obviously targeting this d6 pawn, but also in a lot of lines putting pressure on the c5 pawn as well, because of this sort of discovery using the bishop. The c5 pawn at the moment really isn't defended by that d6 pawn. So this is another idea that sort of comes into play, or at least threatens to come into play a bit later on. Knight goes back to a6. Queen comes to d2, threatening the h6 pawn, so king h7 to defend. And I played a4. My idea here, twofold. Obviously, if you say pushes past with b4, for example, then I can jump the knight into b5, and again putting a lot of pressure on this d6 pawn, and it's not really that easy to defend. He has to play some probably awkward looking moves like bishop f8 to try and defend properly, and then maybe I can work on figuring out a way to get sort of this other knight. What I'd like to do is get this knight from here, e2 up to c4, and again continue to put pressure on this pawn on d6. So yeah, I'd be happy with this position. I also might have ideas of, again depending on what black does, maybe there's other ideas in the position. I might have an idea of maybe a5 at some stage. Maybe bring the bishop to d3. Again, a lot of it's depending on what black does to try and defend. But this type of position I was very happy with a lot of pressure on d6. Again, making it tough for black to sort of hold things together in this position. However, obviously this didn't happen, and Peng Yu played b takes a4, which was another move I was more than happy to see. Played rook takes, so now I actually have some pressure down the a file as well. Rather than bringing this rook to, say, the centre with the c or d files, this time I'm using it to get pressure down the a file, and in particular targeting eventually this a7 pawn, which in effect turns out to be what decides the game. He played queen b6, logical move attacking my b pawn, and I just played knight back to d1 to defend. Bishop d7, obviously attacking and developing and attacking the rook. So the rook drops back to a3, bishop comes to b5, rook to e1. He takes the knight on e2, I recash with the rook, and knight c7. So this knight's preparing to come to this b5 square. Played knight e3, now that I've overprotected the b2 pawn, and again that knight's heading for that dream square that it's looking for, c4, that's been hit before all game. Peng Yu plays knight b5, I get knight c4 in. Obviously I've got the tempo on the queen. Obviously if he does take, I can take the queen, he takes the bishop, and I can simply move the queen and attack the knight. So I still end up ahead out of that sort of exchange. So he plays queen back to d8. Again, fairly logical. Now I need to do something about the rook, but I also have more pressure now with the knight on c4, so I've got more pressure on d6, so we increase that by playing rook to a6. Again, he has to do something about these d6 pawns, so bishop f8. Bishop d3. So my idea here is twofold. If I can, I want to get rid of, if I'm able to, swap this bishop for this knight. Obviously, because the knight is doing a pretty good job defending d6 at the moment, it's going to be about sort of piling up on this d6 square. Knight goes to h5, threatening that dark squared bishop, which is a bishop I really need to keep. So bishop dropped back to h2. Queen came out to h4. I guess potentially threatening stuff. So I simply played queen e1 to try and obviously swap the queen off. I think this position is good for me if the queens come off, just because my pieces are really on much better squares than the black pieces. I think if you compare pieces, this knight on c4 is a fantastic piece. This bishop on h2 might look like it's doing a lot, but the fact that stacking this d6 pawn is really good. And if you compare those pieces to the black pieces, the knight on b5 is actually on a pretty reasonable square. It's doing a useful job helping defend both the a7 and d6 pawns. The bishop on f8 at the moment is just passively defending the d pawn. The knight out on h5 isn't really doing much at the moment. So I'm more than happy with this position, and if the queens come off, which is what actually happened, I think my position is actually much better. So we swapped queens, and he played rook to d8, obviously helping to protect that d6 pawn, and I played rook e1. Another fairly logical move, I think, trying to again put pressure on down the a file. Brought the knight back to g7, so potentially that could go back to e8 to help again with the overprotection of d6. Interesting idea, which may or may not have been the best. I played knight a5 here. The idea obviously is jumping into the c6 square with a fork. He played knight d4 in response, which obviously covers that c6 square, and lets the rook attack the b pawn. So rook a2, rook d7 to help defend the a7 pawn. Here I had my idea. I want to try and find a way to do one of a few things. I want to either get rid of this bishop on d4, sorry, the knight on d4, or I want to use my other pieces over here on the queen side. I'm trying to do something with these bishops. So here I play bishop f4. The alternative in this position, Fritz's suggestion, is to play knight c6 anyway, and after takes play bishop c4, with the idea after say bishop a8 you just play the bishop of d5, overprotect the c pawn, and then there's one of two options here. You can either play for a break with e5 in the center, or you can swing this white squared bishop over to the a5 square and have this big sort of, have the threats that way on the rook, and then if possible sort of play c7 and attack the a pawn, block the defense there, or again maybe sort of even bishop b6 to again put more pressure on the a7 pawn. So this is an alternative which I kind of considered, but I don't actually mind it, but at the time I didn't think it was actually that good. I missed sort of this bishop c4 and bishop d5 idea first to sort of overprotect the c pawn. So if I'd seen this bishop d5 idea, I had looked at this sort of bishop rerouting idea, but yeah, I really think this is a very good way for white to play the position, and again it really shows the dominance of, well, the superiority at least, of the white pieces compared to the black pieces, the minor pieces at least. So after rook d7, instead of doing that, I played bishop to f4. The knight came back to e8 for black. I just brought my knight back to c4. The knight went back to b5 in response. And here I just played king f1. At this stage we were both starting to get short of time. It was actually, rather than a plus 30-second increment, it was a game that was 60 minutes with a 10-second increment. So you actually didn't have to record once you got under 5 minutes, and we'll see what happened a bit later on. I actually stopped recording this as well. And my idea here, given that we were both short of time, was to try and make the defensive task for me easier, or in some senses remove the counter chances. So in this position I really only have one weakness in the position, and that's the b2 pawn. At the moment I have the rook on a2 and the knight on c4 defending it. I can see that black's planning to probably bring this bishop to g7 and sort of again put pressure down this long diagonal. It's already got the rook, and potentially the other rook could come to the b file as well to add to that. So what I need to do is do something about overprotecting this b pawn, and my idea was simply to basically bring the king across to help protect the pawn. And I figured this wasn't really going to cost me anything. The only other weakness I really have in the position is the g2 pawn. I probably should make those yellow. The g2 pawn and the b2 pawn are really my only two weaknesses in this position, and the g2 pawn is really very difficult for black to get at. The b2 pawn is the obvious target, so if I can overprotect that, my pieces can... it gives me a lot more flexibility in the position. So black played king g8. I also thought that this king march idea was useful as a way to obviously help make quick moves where I can gain a little bit of time, but it wasn't really... I'm not really taking away any threats that I might already have. I might not be adding any threats, but I'm not really changing the position significantly. So all the threats that I still have now, these sort of bishop d2, bishop a5 ideas, the pressure down the a file, the knight a5, knight c6 ideas are all still there. But I'm not actually giving black sort of clear ideas about what to do, which is something that I think is useful to consider when playing in time trouble situations. You don't want to give your opponent, if you possibly can, you don't want to give them clear-cut lines that they can sort of blitz out moves, gain time where they're actually making good moves quickly. So king e1, continuing this king walk. Knight from e8 to c7, so I just dropped the rook back to a5. He played a6, so now he's looking at trying to defend the pawn on a6 rather than on a7, so that knight on the c7 is going to be the critical defender. I continued with the king walk. He played his rook back to d8. Now I played knight d2. We'll see that, I guess it's a bit odd, but my idea here is to possibly try and, I guess it's twofold. Again, I want to use my pieces to try and either create further weaknesses or exchange pieces. So in this case, my knight is actually headed to... going to e3 eventually, from where it can go to g4 and target the h6 pawn, or it might be able to come across to a3 and target the knight on b5. So Peng Yu here, again, not really doing much. He's just been shuffling his rook for the last few moves. Knight back to f1. Knight comes into d4. Again, it's not really anything that I need to be concerned about. I could take on a6, but again I wanted to, if at all possible, maintain the bishop pair. So I played knight e3, bishop e7, so that gave me a pawn. I noticed that obviously g5 could be a possibility here, but I've always got h4 as a bailout so that my bishop doesn't get trapped. Play rook up to b3, bishop c2. He took on c2, which I'm happy about in this position. So recaptured, and he played bishop the rook back to b4. This is where I stopped recording. So from here on in, the next few moves are a bit of a reconstruction, and then following on from that, there's some other moves that I didn't end up getting, and I sort of, it was that long between finishing the game and then putting it in the computer that I couldn't actually remember the whole sequence of sort of 20 or 30 moves after we both stopped recording. So anyway, after rook come to b4, I played rook a4 again, looking to swap rooks. He dropped the rook back to b8, brought the knight back to c4. He dropped the rook back to d8, put the bishop back to e3, and he played f6. And this is where I actually stopped with recording, but eventually what ended up happening, I managed to swap this bishop for this knight, again with this maneuver. He'd basically been this sort of shuffling his rook backwards and forwards between d7 and e8, d7 and d8 a lot of the time. And so after I swapped the bishop and rook off, I managed to pick up the a pawn. Eventually he brought his king forward, and that allowed me to bring the rook to the 7th and swap off another set of rooks, and that's when he resigned. Obviously I'm sort of 2 extra pawns up after I've taken the a pawn. This knight's far superior to this black squared bishop, and with my sort of rooks dominating the a file, even though we managed to swap one set off, he decided that he wasn't going to keep playing on. So that's how it finished up. Overall, I was sort of reasonably happy with the tournament. Obviously a bit disappointed with the 2 losses to George and Emma, but I feel like sort of there's a bit to take from both of those games. They were both on the black side, both to do with systems or lines of a system that I know I need to work on in terms of improving my play, and basically getting used to positions where I don't have activity. If you compare that to sort of the repertoire that I have, I'm used to playing positions where I have sort of space and activity and that sort of thing. So something I need to work on definitely with my black play. Hopefully though you've enjoyed this series, the people who have been watching it, both this episode and the other episodes in the series. The next thing as far as a chess series is concerned is looking at that broken arrow bishop takes c3 line of the modern defence, one of which you saw earlier in this series from one of the earlier rounds. So that's going to be something a bit different. We're going to be using obviously chess-based, but also sort of PowerPoint, some other different ideas in terms of presenting that. So hopefully you find that interesting and keep watching. And don't forget to keep an eye out on the blog, melbournegamescoach.blogspot.com. Thanks for watching.